We are going to move on with our first speaker. And Laura and I were talking earlier, and Laura recalls that this is probably the fourth time, at least, that she's addressed an FRSS audience at one of our conferences, and you'll figure out why that is in just a moment. And many of you are familiar with Laura and her work. It's interesting, when I was looking over her bio, which is on the website and the app, so if you want to take a look at it in detail, you can certainly do that. Lora is the founder of research firm Supply Chain Insights. The company helps supply chain leaders pave new directions in supply chain management. She is the author of the enterprise software blog Supply Chain Shaman. Laura's weekly posts are read by 15,000 followers, and she's well respected on a number of platforms such as Forbes. She's a LinkedIn influencer and has 100,000 followers around the world. And she's co-authored books. Essentially, she has more than 30 years of diverse supply chain experience, 9 years as an industry analyst with Gartner, AMR Research, and Altimeter. Prior to becoming a supply chain analyst, she spent 15 years as a leader in the building of supply chain software. So she's worked with a variety of companies, many in this room: Procter & Gamble, Kraft, Clorox, Dreyer's, Grand Ice Cream, now part of Nestle. So Laura, it's clear she knows the industry inside and out. She works with many of your companies on a regular basis, and we are always excited to hear some of the things that are happening from her point of view. So please join me in welcoming Lora Cecere.
I think this works, yeah?
Yes.
So when I go to a reception or a barbecue, people will say, "Laura, what do you do?" And I say I'm a social scientist. I do active research projects. I'm now followed by 165,000 people on LinkedIn, and I use the LinkedIn database to do research. So I'll share some of the research. And I also am very fortunate to have had some great experiences leading manufacturing teams. I wouldn't be here without Procter & Gamble hiring me as a co-op student in the 1970s, and I worked in contract manufacturing for a company called General Foods that got bought by Kraft. I led that for a guy by the name of Roger Miller. And then I started up direct store delivery and Dreyer's Grand Ice Cream, and got into software. So along my journey, I've always been kind of that maverick girl that asks why, right? And I remember the first F4SS conference that I spoke at. I was actually subbed for my boss. It was one of those days, it was about 3 o'clock. My boss said, "I want you to get on a flight to San Diego." I almost missed the connection in Atlanta, ran from A terminal to D terminal, got on the San Diego flight. They couldn't land in San Diego, so I got diverted to LA, got bused to Ontario one of those days, 4 a.m., stood up at the conference in a similar way. And I talked about how the supply chain was changing, how cycles and rhythms of the supply chain were changing. And I challenged people that we need to rethink, to learn from the past, to unlearn, to rethink supply chain, because we don't have best practices. We don't. And I'm going to talk about how supply chains today are stuck, and I'm going to share my research. So after I finished talking, I talked to my boss, and he said, "How did it go?" And I said, "Well, it was sort of like the Arab talking at the Passover dinner, they'll never have me back." And, I've been back 4 times, and I always have a similar message of we are not attacking this problem in a way that is current with the industry challenges, and we need to rethink, to learn from the past, to unlearn, to redesign the future. So I'm Lora Cecere. I'm a social scientist. I'm also a critic of technology, and I write for the business leader. So one of the reasons why I left Gartner is I don't like writing for the IT audience. I like writing for the business leader. And this is where you'll find me. I write for Forbes and on LinkedIn and write books. So when Don first called me, he says, I want you to talk about the efficient supply chain. And I said, I don't believe in the efficient supply chain. My best read article in Forbes is that the efficient supply chain is not the most effective. I believe you have multiple supply chains. You have a need for an efficient supply chain that's the lowest cost per unit, but you also have the elongation of the tail due to the changes in growth strategies with intermittent demand. And by definition, that supply chain cannot be efficient. That supply chain needs to be agile, which is the same cost, quality, and customer service given the level of demand and supply variability. Most people don't measure variability, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that, because what is happening is we have efficiently amplitude the bullwhip effect. I mean, have you ever played the beer game? I'm not talking about the one we did in college, right? I'm talking about the one that's about the bullwhip effect, right? What has happened is, as we have focused on the efficient supply chain, we have amplified the variation, and we have distorted the signal so that we have a lot of noise. We have the opportunity to redefine the supply chain with new technologies, but we're really not aggressive about that because we want to follow standardization and these supposed best practices. So I want to strip you of the belief you have best practices. I want you to be open to the outcome, because as we look at today's technology, we're functional. We've automated functions, manufacturing, procurement, transportation. But source, make, and deliver can't work together very well. And we are not good at the translation of demand. And in fact, demand should not be seen as forecasting. Demand is the river that flows through the supply chain. Then we need to sense and translate. Our current processes are linear. I'm going to talk to you about rules-based ontologies and cognitive computing and the ability to have multiple ifs to multiple thens. And the fact that most of the technology we've invested in, like ERP and APS, is legacy, and we really need to be thinking about how we evolve to be able to have very flexible systems that are not so focused on transactions, right? Transactions are very much about numbers. Supply chain's about the world of gray. Only a third of companies today have what-if capabilities. 2/3 of companies don't know where their second and third tier suppliers are. Guess what's going to be happening in the next couple of months? Anybody worried about what's happening with the virus? Special products coming out of China? Because people don't know where their sourcing is, we're going to have a lot of surprises. And we're not going to catch up from this virus in the supply chain for 2 to 3 quarters. You're going to live through a case study that is a great opportunity for you to have a different conversation at the board level about the need for what-if analysis, about the need for risk mitigation and how you do sourcing, and to be able to work on supplier development and the automation of networks. We're going to see a lot of failures. Let's just hope you don't end up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, because I got to tell you, I've been there and it's not pleasant. Also, our processes are inside out. They're not outside in. Why was General Mills, who sat on the biggest database of point-of-sale data, not able to see the downturn in the cereal market after the last recession? Well, it's because General Mills focused on orders, not on customer consumption. So as we think about what we have built, the efficient supply chain, very focused on transactions, we have not really designed a fit-for-purpose supply chain, one that's cross-functional, one that allows nonlinearity, one that can sense, one that can learn, one that can adapt. It's just as important to answer the questions you don't know to ask than the questions you know to ask, right? When Kellogg had smelly liners in their cereal, they didn't think to ask the question, do my liners stink, right? But if they had been mining social sentiment, they could have seen it from their customers. And our processes need to be outside in. So as we think about this and the need to learn from the past, to unlearn, to rethink, and accept the fact that what we've been doing today is legacy, It's time for us to step up. What is an effective supply chain? What is the goal? When people say they want to have efficient supply chain, I say you have multiple supply chains. You have a supply chain that's high volume and very predictable, and that's an efficient supply chain. Run that with the lowest cost per unit. And that is the supply chain you should probably outsource to contract manufacturing because you know what the demand signal is. And then you have the agile supply chain, which has a lot of intermittent demand, which you can measure by coefficient of variation, which needs to have the same cost, quality, and customer service. And then you have the responsive supply chain, which is very short cycles. A pharmaceutical company is a short cycle supply chain. But our outcome really needs to be looking at performance and improvement and resilience. So if you're a poorly performing supply chain, it's really easy to drive improvement. If you're a mature supply chain, performance is tough. So when we think about new technology, we've got to think about what is our goal. One of the issues we've had in optimization is we haven't been clear on our goal. And we haven't aligned our goal across functions, and today's organization is not aligned on what supply chain means, and supply chain means something very different at every organization. So I got this email last week from a financial analyst, right? Read the email. Tell me what you think it means. This is a group of financial analysts that are covering companies that are consumer packaged goods and food and beverage, and quite frankly, they're angry. They're angry because they've had all these promises that we're going to have all these investments and all these programs, and they don't see that we're driving improvement. We're not driving market share, and we're not able to drive insights. We're drowning in data, and we're really low on insights. So they said, Laura, come and talk to us about why this is. And I'm like, really simply, it's a leadership. It's a supply chain thinking problem. We're thinking about today's supply chain in the same old way as when I was hired in the 1970s to run manufacturing. Today's supply chain needs to be rethought from the customer's customer to the supplier's supplier to be able to run multiple supply chains against outcomes and goals. So we're stuck. And I want to convince you of that. And then I'm going to talk about technology. Okay, you ready? So when I was an AMR analyst and I worked on what's now the Gartner Top 25, I believed that we had spent 1.7% of tech revenue on technology, and we had driven improvement at the intersection of cost and inventory. Do you believe that? Well, we haven't. And what I did was I took 20 years of financial data, and I started mining them in orbit charts. And I'm going to show you some of the orbit charts. And what I'm doing is I'm following why we're having issues. So let's look at apparel retail, right? We did the labor arbitrage strategy into Asia. We elongated the supply chain. Have we made progress? This is an orbit chart. The goal is we want to go up towards the best scenario. Costs have deteriorated, inventory turns have deteriorated. Can we say that's best practice? I don't think so. Let's talk about grocery retail. Definitely the Amazon effect, right? When we look at the fall in inventory turns and the loss of margins, right? Tremendous issues. This is personal products. These are things like cosmetics and lipsticks, right? When we look at the shifts, ouch. Let's look at the chemical industry. Every company in this room has made the long tail longer, and this industry did not adapt for shorter cycles and to be able to run. So let's look at some industry players. This is Kimberly-Clark and P&G. You do not see the error, right? You don't see the improvement. You see a lot of squiggly lines. It's because no one in this industry is making progress. That's Kimberly-Clark and P&G, and it got a little bit distorted when they took it from one slide deck to the other, but you can see Kimberly-Clark over this period of time had margin of 14% and 6.13 turns. But look at the path, right? And this is P&G, margins of 20%, 6.05 turns. Look at the path. But everyone is making improvement recently because of oil prices, right? So we're not driving that intersection of cost and inventory. In fact, our inventory levels are higher today than they were before the last recession. Next recession, which I think is coming pretty soon, it will take longer. So as we think about supply chains, we have to think about balance sheet, and we have to think about balanced metrics. And to do that, and the reason I put this up here is I did a long study with Arizona State University where I said, what is an effective supply chain? And I measured it by market capitalization, and I looked at companies that were doing better on these metrics as a balanced portfolio would actually have higher market capitalization. And I did this for the period of time of 2000 to 2015, and I'm going to redo it for my new book. But companies that were able to drive a balanced scorecard against these metrics would do better on market capitalization and would have better resiliency, which is the ability to have tight, predictable patterns over time. So when I look at how we get there, we must take the functional metrics to focus on reliability. In other words, we no longer measure OEE. OEE is a dangerous measure. We measure first-time yield, and we measure schedule adherence. Let me say that again. OEE and the lowest cost of manufacturing throws the supply chain out of balance. Because when we do that, we are not necessarily looking at the right inventory mix and customer service. So Source really needs to look at alignment and first-pass yield and reliability. Sales collaboration, where we ask sales what they're going to sell, has thrown the supply chain out of balance because it's introduced bias and error. So to drive balance sheet performance, we must first agree on the outcome, align the functions against a balanced scorecard. Okay, so I believe they're stuck. And my research says that supply chain leaders agree. So when I do research and I say, how do you describe your supply chain? They say independent silos, right? Contract manufacturing is not necessarily aligned with procurement, not necessarily aligned with manufacturing, not necessarily aligned with transportation, not necessarily aligned with distribution. You got to fix that, right? They're cautious. They're fixed. They don't move. They're not agile. We don't design our supply chain. I was a chemical engineer. I couldn't get out of school unless I did a design project. I am really good at distillation columns and heat exchangers, but only 10% of supply chains are designed, right? And think about how we're losing our ability to really be effective because we're not actively designing supply chains for inventory buffers and feasible supply plans and where things should be located. They're reactive, right? We reward reactivity. So to make it work well, we have to be more agile and we have to be more controlled. And we have to align these silos. I was presenting the other day and I was challenged by the audience. The gentleman said, I thought we were aligned, right? But my research for the last 15 years shows that we are not aligned on the definition of supply chain excellence. And because we're not aligned, we throw the supply chain out of balance. And because we're not aligned, we do not serve our markets on customer service, nor do we service our shareholders. Now, U.S. productivity stopped in 2004. I was part of mobile phones and computers on everybody's desk, and I was really shocked by this, that we've not made more impact in manufacturing productivity. And inventory levels are higher now than they were in 2007, and we shouldn't be proud of that. And because they're higher, we've elongated payables, pushing cost and waste back in the supply chain on those that are less able to pay. And we've not been really good at supplier development. Our long tail's growing, Our supply chains have not adapted. So I come to you today to say supply chains are stuck. Does anybody disagree with me? Does anybody think we have best practices? If we have more inventory, we're less competitive. How can we say we have best practices? Does anybody disagree? Because I want to talk to you about how to think about new technologies. You know, as we go about redesigning the supply chain to be more effective, because we're going to get clear on goals and we're going to help our leadership teams to understand what it takes, and we're going to learn from the past, to unlearn, to rethink the supply chain, we have to think about what got us here, right? We believed in best practices. We chased shiny objects, right? Whether it was CPFR or VMI or DDMRP now. We focused on functional excellence, right? I ran a manufacturing plant. You know, I really wanted to be the best manufacturing plant manager possible. I believed one size fits all. We had one supply chain, and our practices are inside out. So as we think about the why, right, and we think about these as historic practices, not really ones that we want to pass on to our centers of excellence. And as we think about shiny objects, we want to fail forward. We want to test but verify. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a case study. And we're going to move functional metrics towards reliability. And we're going to measure the supply chain and understand the number of supply chains and go outside in. Let's take a case study, because I want to just give you a case study so this will resonate. This is a company that I worked with. They shorted 1 out of 2 orders. Their deductions for 2020 are expected to be $9 million. Everybody understand what a deduction is? It's where retailers will penalize you. Their deductions in 2003 were $3,000. Now they're really up to $9 million. Order shortages were not measured. They had multiple ERP systems. They couldn't agree on why do they short orders. And it took 6 months to get started on why they short orders. So if we look at the order short data, first pass yield and schedule adherence were the major issues. This organization had 95% asset utilization, was continually running an infeasible plan because it's impossible to run 95% asset utilized, didn't design the supply chain, and manufacturing was not aligned with sourcing and distribution. Now you can see up there demand was small, but demand ends up being a big driver. And packaging, the ability to get packaging artwork through the system was a major driver. So we mapped the river of demand, and this is where I recommend people start. We're very supply-centric. If we draw a supply chain, in fact, I do this with classes, I say, draw a supply chain, and I give people a blank sheet of paper and crayons. And they'll typically start with a supplier, and then they'll draw a truck, and then they'll draw a manufacturing plant. But the supply chain starts with a customer, and the river of demand runs through the supply chain from the customer's customer to the supplier's supplier. And along the way on the river of demand, we translate and sense. Now, no company in consumer packaged goods and food and beverage is good at using retail data. I've studied this for 20 years. It sits in sales teams. VMI signals only go to order management. And we run the supply chain on the basis of an order. An order has only a historic perspective, and because of the long tail of the supply chain, demand latency for an order has tripled in my career in the supply chain. So why don't we use retail data? Why do we not sense and learn and use schema and read capabilities and redefine demand? Because it's different. And because people want to invest and have assured ROI. And because we're used to demand being forecasting based upon orders. We're not used to managing the rhythms and cycles of the supply chain and managing a river of demand. So in this particular supply chain, we mapped the rocks in their demand river. They had unforecasted cases associated with product portfolio, new items. Those items were never forecasted, and this particular organization was very heavily asset utilized. We also had a team that believed that they were better at manual inventory adjustments than a technology system because they didn't measure forecast value add, coefficient of variation, and effectiveness of inventory mix. How many of your organizations are measuring forecast value add? It's the number one thing I want you to get out of this, is most of our systems are not giving us a better demand forecast. Forecast value add says I'm going to hold myself accountable for the forecasting signal to say, is my system giving me a better signal than the last 3 months of historic shipments? That is forecast value add. Coefficient of variation says, how forecastable is my data? So this was their demand analysis. So if you look at the naive forecast versus mean absolute percent error, you can see that this company was degrading the forecast across the long tail. So the long tail really looks at volume and how frequently is that item ordered. Demand was degraded. The historic shipments were better. Where do we actually use contract manufacturing? In most organizations, it's on the long tail of the supply chain. Very few organizations hold themselves accountable for forecast error. I remember working with Jabil, and Jabil actually would set up a price agreement that if you were good at demand forecasting, you would get a discount. I think that is really something for us to think about, is we need to own our demand signal because the inaccuracy in the demand signal creates waste and inefficiency in a planet that we're polluting. So the other thing is managing multiple supply chains in this particular client, because they believed they had one supply chain, and we measured coefficient of variation. Anybody measured coefficient of variation? Good. It measures how forecastable is the data. And this particular client, we found that Canada had a much more difficult forecasting problem because it was not as forecastable as the North American market. And we found that intermittent demand had grown and that they needed to really look at phase in, phase out. So they had 5 supply chains. They had a very forecastable, was very efficient, an intermittent demand supply chain, a phase in, phase out, a seasonal supply chain, and one that needed to be made to order. Not one supply chain, and the tactics needed to change. Right? When we were looking at phase in, phase out, we need to be thinking about attribute-based forecasting. Of course, holding ourselves accountable for forecast value add. Where I have intermittent demand and make to order, I want to have short cycles. I want to manage the demand signal. So, why are we stuck? We believe we have best practices. We're not holding ourselves accountable for the signals of the supply chain. We've chased shiny objects without really holding ourselves accountable. We've thrown the supply chain out of balance with functional metrics. And we've managed it like we have one supply chain. So as we think about the digital revolution that could be, I'm going to ask you to think about how could we change the electrons and the molecules of the supply chain so that it could be different. Now, many times when people think about digital transformation, they think about doing the same old thing they've been doing, but faster and without paper. And that's really not going to help us. We need to change supply chain fundamentals. And supply chain fundamentals say, how do I make what the customer needs the most effectively? How do I sense customer changes and translate? And it isn't one technology that's going to help us. It's really using the combination of technologies and asking ourselves fundamental questions about what is supply chain effectiveness. How many are you invested in open source analytics, have conversations about schema on read and Kafka and Hadoop? Okay, our traditional supply chain thinking is we got to have really clean data, we stuff it all into rows and columns, and when we do that, we're all happy, right? Open source analytics started when our e-commerce retailers could not get traditional relational databases to scale. And open source analytics allow us to run big problems and to be able to mine data without having to put them in rows and columns. Schema on read allows us to read the data as we need it off of the data lakes. This is the whole world of data scientists, right? Most supply chain leaders haven't really retooled to think about open source analytics. This makes the job of the DBA less important, and it also undermines the technologies of the ERP vendors and the advanced planning vendors. Streaming data, Internet of Things, tremendous potential, whether it's telematics, weather data, GPS data, or all those PLCs I used to program on the manufacturing line. The problem is that without open source analytics, there's no place to put the streaming data. So the basic architectures have to change and our processes have to change. A lot of times people will say, I need real-time data. And I'm like, let's be careful. We need data at the speed of business. Most real-time data is going to cause us to be very reactive, and we need to be proactive, right? So we need data at the speed of business, and we need architectures that allow us to evolve. 3D printing. How many of the products should we 3D print? You know, our special samples, our artwork. 3D printing is a tremendous opportunity, as is robotics, to be able to do routine tasks, wearables and mobility to get us out of paper, cognitive computing to be able to have multiple ifs to multiple thens, to be able to sense and learn. So if you think about today's supply chain, we have single ifs to single thens. Think about ATP or available to promise or allocation logic or substitution logic. Those are all single ifs to single thens. We don't have the ability to have learning to be able to adapt. We can't use ATP with allocation with substitution logic, but cognitive computing and rules-based ontologies allow us to learn and to merge rules together, sort of like routers allowed us to network much more effectively. And then as we think about blockchain, which is having some scalability issues, but is still a promising technology, right? So data will no longer be in all those rows and columns bedded down for the night. Instead, it's going to be in clouds, it's going to be in streams, and it's going to be pooled. And we're going to design how data flows, and so we can use it. And if you look at data adoption and what people are working on today, they're primarily working on data visualization, right? Tableau, Spotfire, Microsoft's BI product. That's where most people are investing. But when we think about unstructured text mining, looking at sentiment analysis, which I'll give you some examples, or we look at Internet of Things architectures, or we look at concurrent optimization, these analytic techniques are very promising, but you don't get them from the traditional software vendors, and they don't fit traditional processes, right? And so we have this whole confluence of new forms of analytics that open up new processes, but only if we're open. And only if we allow teams of people to experiment without having to give a fixed ROI to go test and learn, right? Unstructured text mining is a great opportunity. So I say, let's start by drawing your river of demand. Let's start by charting how many supply chains you have, and then let's look at all your data types, right? Let's look at high velocity data types. Let's look at unstructured data. And let's map your year, and let's look for the opportunities. So I was looking with a high-tech distributor. And the high-tech distributor really wanted to be customer-centric. And they judged the supply chain by net promoter skills in an annual survey. And I laughed, and I said, what good is an annual survey? What data do you have in your organization that can be mined that can answer how satisfied are customers with you? They had 12,000 emails a month that sat in the email boxes of the customer service reps. So I said, let's put text mining on top of that. Let's segment your customers, and let's look at the patterns of what your customers are telling you each week, and let's have teams that listen to data. Unfortunately, all of the consumer products and food and beverage companies are so used to yelling their message, they don't listen. They don't listen. And so as we listen to what customers think, we can become much more customer-centric. And we can use that data into cognitive computing, into robotic process automation for customer service. It's a great opportunity. And then I had another company that made basic men's underwear. And their problem was that their average customer was 55, and the 55-year-old man does not buy as much underwear as a young man, which, okay. And they wanted to redesign their supply chain. I can see there are a lot of men in this audience who relate to that. They wanted to change the demographics of their product. So they said to Lora, how can we do that? And I said, well, you've done really well on Amazon, which, by the way, the coefficient of variation on Amazon is very high. It's almost 0.8. And I said, what if we mine the Amazon data, which most people don't know how to mine the Amazon data. And what if we don't just look at selling on Amazon? What if we look at testing and learning on Amazon, whether it's pack size or color or price variation, because we know the age of people and they load their baskets. And then what if we take that test and learn and we put a continual test and learning cycle into how you do your statistical modeling for end-aisle displays and how you do category management. So that particular company has changed the average buyer from 55 to 40 and is steadily getting market share because they've used the supply chain to test and learn. Now, most of the time, our new products are outsourced to contract manufacturers with a really bad demand signal, and we wait for orders to tell us our second production run, and it's a flip of a coin. We'd do better at Las Vegas, right? Now, what if we tested and learned? What if we got good at using the Amazon data? What if we got good at using all our e-commerce, rating and review data? We could test and learn and drive a better signal. First thing, draw your river of demand. Second thing, map your supply chain. Third, look at your problems, look at your data, and think creatively. This is the Lenovo case study. Lenovo is one of the 2 companies I know that have active listening posts. Monthly, they get together like sales and operations planning, and they listen and they look at the patterns around the world. So here they're looking at keyboard failures, and they're thinking about what are they doing, and they're sensing off of unstructured text mining. This is an example of rules-based ontology and cognitive learning. What if we had multiple ifs to multiple thens, and we had the ability to learn at each of the nodes of the supply chain? And this was overarching, which gave us a semantic layer to learn what we didn't know, to use unstructured data and structured data. And this is what is available today to overlay onto supply chains if we're open, right? I believe 5 years from now, we'll be talking about the world of analytics very differently. We'll talk about, you remember that F4SS meeting where we talked about analytics and that crazy lady got up and talked about mining the unknown data to answer the unknown question, the question you don't know to ask, and talked about discovery. So we're very close to being able to have the digital twin that will allow you to stand in your supply chain, model the supply chain effectiveness, and to be able to look at design in vitro, right? To be able to look at how source, make, and deliver can work together. But to do that, we've got to say, what is the data that's available that I'm not using? Because 80% of the data is unstructured data. And how do I hold technologists accountable for their promise? Because most people are not happy with supply chain planning. They don't know how to test it, and they don't know how to drive improvement. And how do I help executives to understand this world we're living in that's a complex nonlinear system that's become much more intricate, right? So the ability to have a 3D twin, to be able to look at discovery, build that learning organization, mine the data you don't know, answer the questions you don't know, is where we're headed. It's an example of a descriptive analytics tool that allows you to see, when you come in the morning, stuff that's happening in the organization based upon your prior inquiries, and gives you updates about, you ask the system to look at XYZ, here's some updates about what's happening in these areas, right? When I was a supply chain planner for Clorox, it took me 6 hours to manage my exceptions, right? I would come in, have a cup of coffee. 5 hours later, I'd go to a meeting at 1 o'clock, and then 1 to 4, then I would go do my job. And it was very taxing because the exceptions were hard to work through. I couldn't get to data, and that's the world we live in today. So we've got to align engines with outcomes, lots of different data, lots of different engines, and we need master data and planning. These are things like lead times and cycle times. How long is it taking us to get through a port? How long is it taking us to move a cycle through a manufacturing line? We run our planning systems based on outdated data. And our evolution of insights is going from descriptive analytics into prescriptive analytics, into cognitive analytics. The supply chain today is a lot like the old days when I was going somewhere and I would print out a map. I don't know if any of you used to do that, right? We'd print out a map, right? And we'd usually put it right in the seat beside us, or we'd ask our friend to go along with us and get some coffee, and they'd tell us which turn to make. And then we got those little devices. Do you remember the TomToms and, all those little devices, right? And we'd put them in our dashboards, and they would tell us where to go. And now, I don't know what I'd do without Google Maps, right, telling me what's happening, right? Imagine if you could make that same transition with your supply chain. You can do it if you embrace the new world of analytics and you're open to learn, and you can champion teams to be able to look at things like localized assortment, not just look at averages. I'm going to talk about one other topic, and then I'm going to pass it off to the next speaker. We talk about networks. But networks today work on the back of Excel and EDI and portals. None of that is effective. EDI is a lot like mail, right? When you get a piece of mail, you open it, it's outdated, it's not bidirectional, it's not current. A portal is like moving down a dead-end street. There's no system of record, it's really not useful. And email, we're crazy to think we're running effective supply chains on email. So in the future, supply chains are going to be working on networks. And I do a share group where I'm trying to help organizations rethink networks and really holding ourselves accountable for building network capabilities. Today we have supply chain operating networks that are very industry specific and they're very functional. We do not have an overarching architecture that allows us to connect Ariba to E2Open to Elimica to GT Nexus to SupplyOn to Exastar. Think about that chemical company that I showed you that's really struggling. They serve all of those. Likewise, we don't hold ourselves accountable for asset utilization and truck weighting in a shared base, which is transportation. So in the future, we're not going to compete company to company. We're going to compete supply chain to supply chain. And we're going to learn that the hard way in what's happening in China. Right? We're suddenly going to change from CNN talking about supply chain to talking about value networks. Today, before I came down, I did 2 interviews, one with the Wall Street Journal and one with the Financial Times, and we talked about how long will it take us to rebound from what's happening in China. It'll be quarters, right? Supply that you don't know is going to be a surprise. So what is a network, right? It's not EDI, one-to-one. It's not really supply chain operating networks, one-to-many. Instead, it's being able to build visibility and bidirectional processes that cross multiple entities. We do not have good systems today that allow us to do that. And if you're thinking that a control tower that you're going to build is going to answer that question, you're sadly mistaken, because it only serves you, it doesn't serve the network. So when we look at visibility, there are many forms of visibility, and this is from my research. And, there's looking at what do customers need, where are we in manufacturing, what are we doing in transportation. We have no way to align this. So one of the things that I'd like people to do is to think about adopting the ISO 8000 standards for supplier onboarding. Do you know what ISO 8000 standards are, ALEI? Most people use proxy identifiers of DUNS or GS1, but the ALEI is an authoritative identifier which allows you to know the entity in which you're dealing with. One of the biggest issues we have on networks, even though we are poorly defining them today, is trading partner onboarding. ALEIs are the legal identities of when you created your formation of your corporation. So as we think about vendor masters and we think about suppliers, this is a case study from Corning. Look at the data. Look at the redundancy in the supplier master and our ability to communicate, because we don't have good master data. And we haven't really automated the trading partner onboarding systems. Yeah? Anybody using ISO 8000 standards, ALEI? It's a great opportunity for you to standardize the supplier master data and to be able to streamline the trading partner onboarding. This is a trading partner onboarding form that we've worked on that goes along with it. So what does the network of the future look like? Blockchain needs to grow up. We've done a lot of testing on blockchain. I do a lot of work with IBM, and I'm like, we are fooling the industry that blockchain is ready today. It is a promising technology that's overhyped. Cognitive computing for being able to manage master data helps us, and the ability to mine unstructured text and to build the canonicals. The canonical is a way that we can take a series of processes into the cloud and have an agreed process. I would love to see F4SS build a canonical of a standard work process for contract manufacturing for this industry. And to be able to automate it through cognitive computing and bring that to the cloud. I was talking to Google the other day, and I'm like, we just really need to up our game in this area, because blockchain is an answer today only for enterprise, not really inter-enterprise. And we've got to be able to move the canonicals and move interoperability between supply chain operating networks. And if we can do this, a lot of things could change. We can improve food safety. We can improve supply chain finance, assuming that we aren't always trying to elongate payables and push cost and waste down the supply chain. And we can improve interoperability. So my work on managing the share group, which is called the Network of Networks, which anybody that's interested is free to join. It's an open group. I don't charge anybody. We're working on testing of these technologies and really trying to push Ariba and Elimica and EDA Open to interoperate. What I've learned is we have asked for an integrated end-to-end supply chain, and that's the wrong ask. An integrated end-to-end supply chain is inflexible and only moves data, it doesn't move the context. Interoperability allows us to have a more agile supply chain. Cognitive computing allows us to be able to have a flexible transport of data, right? And so we need to up our game to not just think about linear flows, but to think about nonlinear flows, and not just think about flows in manufacturing, but to think about source, make, and deliver together. And that master data, we need to own it. We need authoritative identifiers, and we need clean data, and we need to own the data we pass to trading partners. So, what can you learn from Lora Cecere today? The effective supply chain starts with leadership. It starts with leadership guiding an organization to understand what's needed by the customer, what's needed to win in the future. Outperforming supply chains are fit for purpose. I do an annual study called the Supply Chains to Admire, and the companies that test and design the supply chain for new business models win. Sleep Number won last year because of the redesign of the supply chain to look at how do they drive the supply chain that's fit for purpose. 67% of supply chains drive performance in single metrics. Could be cost this year, inventory the next, could be cash flow. But this balanced scorecard and alignment of the organization, the balanced scorecard and driving functional metrics is really important because those functional metrics have to be driven based upon reliability. Companies that focus on innovation outperform. Companies that won't make this pivot will really hold teams accountable for fixed ROI, for investment in new forms of analytics, and they'll miss the boat. We should deal with technology a lot like we do with R&D, where we have co-development and really understanding these new technologies. And the IT organizations currently report to the chief financial officer, and it all becomes about cost. We can't test and learn and evolve. We need to question the status quo. Supply chains are stuck, and we can't save our way to value. Value has to be driven by leadership. So my name's Lora Cecere. I'm a social scientist. I've spoken at F4SS 4 times. And every time I speak, I ask you to think about the supply chain of the future and to embrace the supply chain of the past as being in the past. Because the future we can create for us drives economies and hopefully will help us save the planet. Thank you very much. Any questions for me? Any questions? Yes, hi. Can you tell me your name and your company?
You had me at hello. Is it on? Doesn't sound any louder. Okay. So I work for a contract manufacturer. This all sounds fabulous and awesome. How do we propel the industry forward and try to get these things to happen when we really need the customers to take the first step? I've put so many of these concepts in front of customers, and you get something between, yeah, that sounds really cool, and then they go on to their next thing, or deer in the headlights, I have no idea what you're talking about or how to start. So what's your advice to people like myself sitting in the room that would love to see this happen but aren't sure how to get it to move?
And what's your role in the company?
VP of Manufacturing and Supply Chain.
Okay, so encourage your customers to fund an innovation lab. Invest in the digital twin to be able to simulate the effective frontier and the decisions they're making that are causing waste. Right? The focus on OEE is really a big waste machine. The lack of focus on the right mix of inventory, most people don't know how to do. Most people don't know about coefficient of variation and forecast value add. Invest in being able to show them and try to bring them along. You know, supply chain people are proud, and most of them have been in the industry a long time. And most of them, you know, believe they know the answer. So we have to show them. So simulation, pilots help. Does that help you? Kind of. Okay. Well, I think, you know, you could start by measuring their forecast value add and offer them a better price if they're better at forecasting. Change the discussion. Most companies don't own their forecast. They don't own their cycle for artwork. Make them accountable. Put some skin in the game. Make them accountable.
Hi, Laura. Chris Taylor, Crescent. We're in a contract packaging. You know, I've
Yeah.
heard you over the years at 4SS, and you always liven us up in the beginning to start questioning what in the heck we're doing. What industry or what company in particular do you think really gets the supply chain that you refer to in the future? It's currently doing today or is getting there? What industry or what company?
You know, the companies are different across the sectors. So I think IKEA is making progress in terms of understanding their customer. I think Amazon is all about redesigning the supply chain, right? Whether it's pharmaceuticals, they just made an announcement of offering supply chain planning. I think Amazon wants to be everywhere. I think Sleep Number has done some interesting work. And I think some of the, you know, automotive companies, some of the automotive suppliers, Borg Warner, have done some interesting work, Herman Miller. And in each of these companies, there is an example of continuity of leadership and continuity of purpose and focus. One of the issues that I see in CPG and food and beverage, which was alluded to at the very beginning, is we're changing people a lot, and we don't have continuity of leadership. And I'd be glad to send you my article. In fact, this is my new book that I'm writing, wish me luck, where I'm writing the stories of those that had courage to make a difference. They test the business model Dollar General, dollar value, you know, the cost-conscious consumer. They're testing and learning to make a difference. Does that help? Okay. Good. I did better with you than I did with her. She's still thinking. We're going to have a beer. Okay.
Can I?
Yeah.
This is Erika Nava from the Hershey Company. The first thing I might say is don't give up. Like sometimes we need to listen things more than once to finally get it. But that is what makes you different from other partners, from other co-packers or co-manufacturers. We are always looking for people that bring new technologies for us, but we not always get it at once. So my suggestion is translate the benefit for us. So, okay, it's cool to know that we have that new technology available. Why should I be considering now or tomorrow? I think that can help us to sell the idea better inside our own companies, instead of just saying, this is an external partner suggesting something. Like, if you can help us doing the homework, we can be a better messengers inside.
Awesome. Thank you. You did a better job of answering my question. Good. Okay. Anybody else got a question for me? I think I'm out of time. So thank you very much. I'm hoping that you'll think tonight about supply chains are stuck. We don't have best practices. And we need to learn from the past to unlearn. Thank you.